Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to AP European History with Mr. Bowlby. Today we will be talking about Chapter 17, specifically Sections 1 and 2. And the chapter is entitled Absolutism in Eastern Europe. Chapters 15, 16, and 17 fit together really nicely. And what we'll see here is kind of the conclusion of absolutist movements. And it's apropos that we end with Eastern Europe because Eastern Europe holds out and continues their quest toward absolutist ideals for the longest period of time. The chapter discusses primarily Prussia, Russia, and Austria, or the Habsburg Empire. Today we'll be discussing the development of Austria, and before we start that, we'll be talking about some of the background on what makes absolutism different in Eastern Europe. Your text starts out discussing some of the differences that happen and develop and the ways that they develop in Eastern Europe versus Western Europe. And to give you a little bit of background, they discuss that many peasants experience increased autonomy during the later Middle Ages and moving into the Renaissance, much more freedom. And they were given incentives to populate new lands. They had freedom to move, negotiate with landlords, land ownership, and many more rights than they had had during the early Middle Ages. Western Europe, most maintained this freedom. However, in Eastern Europe, it was reversed. And it was reversed to combat economic problems, but probably, as your book suggests, these economic problems were really a guise for political power and greed. Okay? Lords restricted peasant movement and negotiations over rent. Lords imposed heavier taxes and took more land. And really, the majority of people during this period of time took a step backward and were very poorly treated, mistreated by the nobility. Reestablishment of serfdom. And I had somebody come in and ask today, well, what is a serf? Okay, how does a serf differ from a peasant? And to very simply put it, serfs, for the most part, had what's called hereditary subjugation, meaning they were bound to a lord from one generation to the next. If you were a serf and you had a child, that child was born a serf. Serfs were bound to the land and to the lord with no freedom to move. Okay, peasants were lower class people, but they had the ability to negotiate with their landlords. They had an ability to move. Many peasants sought out different jobs. Maybe some went into the clergy, many moved into towns. And serfdom was arguably a form of slavery. Okay? In most places, you worked under the Lord Monday through Saturday at a bare minimum. You were not paid for this service. You were simply paid in room and board, essentially, on your land. And peasants or serfs suffered greatly during this time because they were heavily taxed, heavily burdened with a surplus, with very little surplus of goods being given to them. This brings about what's called in your text a state agriculture, taking land from the peasants and consolidating into large farm production with free labor provided by the serfs. And we ask, well, how can they do this? They just did it. Okay, this was the nobles taking advantage of very weak monarchs, which happened to be the kind of rule of the day in most areas of Eastern Europe. And they just did it. They said, we're going back to this system, this medieval system, feudally, and they took the land. They didn't give a reason. They weren't compelled necessarily to give a reason. Sometimes it came out of fear-mongering, and scaring people into a belief of what they needed, but for the most part, they just did it. Okay, land came from new legislation allowing lords authority over the peasants, their land, and their freedom. Something that's probably very, very difficult for us to understand. As I mentioned previously, your text alludes that it's not really the economic reasons that are the primary motivation, it's the political reasons. Weak kings had to deal with powerful nobles, and in order to maintain some power, They gave in to the nobles' demands, and the nobles wanted wealth. Really, the kings of these Eastern European nations were really one of the nobles. They were one of the crowd that just happened to be lucky at that point. Um, Peasants had far less political power than they did in the West. They were not able to negotiate terms. They were not able to unify and rebel as successfully. And then perhaps most importantly, the concept of sovereignty, the concept of the idea that a government should provide for its people, which even under absolutist monarchs uh, in Western Europe, there was a belief that there was some exchange that needed to take place. And this wasn't an acknowledged concept in Eastern Europe. Things were simply done for the good of the nobility, the aristocracy. So they took power from urban and middle classes, basically making towns far less important, and the idea of people having the ability to escape from their station in life. And this is really where we get the idea that spreads across Europe that the East is far less civilized and more backward than the West. The rise of the Eastern powers. Okay, under constant threat of war and foreign domestic invaders, Eastern monarchs slowly gain power and centralize their states. And we'll be specifically talking today about Austria. We'll get to Prussia tomorrow. But Prussia ends up being the slightly stronger of the two. They will eventually unify the German people, and this is going to have a profound, profound effect on the next couple of hundred years of European history and the history of the world. Prussia is essentially was made up of two places, both in northern Germany and in northern Poland, that were not yet connected geographically. And Austria was south, and these two, south central Europe, these two powers would struggle over the control of Central Europe for a long time to come. Austria needs to be associated with the Habsburgs, and Austria is made up essentially during this period of time after a few wars and centralization of power of Austria, Bohemia, and Hungary, all of which take very different paths. The Habsburgs survive the 30 Years' War. They don't survive it gracefully, but they do, and they look inward and eastward to solidify a central state. They realize that the expansion westward is not going to be attainable at this point. They've failed at this. So they first look to Bohemia, and this actually happens during the war. Bohemia is what will become a large portion of it will become modern day Czechoslovakia and part of, primarily Germany. And the Habsburgs crush a revolt at White Mountain. This revolt is done by Protestant Czechs, and it reduces their power and gives their land to the Catholic nobles, which is a way that the Habsburgs buy these nobles and buy this centralization of power. Wipes out Protestantism, they enserf the peasantry, and Ferdinand III is able to establish a standing army, centralized government, and set his sights on territorial expansion, specifically Hungary. These are all things that we saw when we studied the absolutist monarchs of Western Europe. Okay, the idea of standing army, the idea of central government, and a bureaucracy. The Austrians want Hungary. However, there's a big roadblock, and that would be the Ottoman Empire. And the Ottoman Empire eventually will become modern-day Turkey, but they were much more expansive during that period of time, perhaps the greatest power in the world during the mid-16th century. During their golden age, or the height, they were led by Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, and they ruled most of southeastern Europe. The bureaucracy was staffed by slaves, and this is a key to kind of their demise. There was very little private property. The Sultan actually was the head of state and protected the people from overzealous upper class people, and even Christians and people of all different religions were treated fairly under their Muslim rulers. And this is what made the empire strong and also would end up weakening the empire. Sloppy leadership, to make a long story short, and a lack of continued expansion slow the Ottoman Empire. There are not enough slaves being provided to run the bureaucracy in a trustworthy fashion. And the Austrians see a chance to seize Hungary, which was under the control of the Ottomans. Austria wants to gain control of Hungary. After holding a siege on Vienna, it was kind of a last-ditch effort by the Ottomans. The Habsburgs are helped by numerous other groups, including King Louis of France, including the Russians, and others. And by 1699, they control all of Hungary and most of Transylvania, or modern-day Romania. And by 1718, they've completed this conquest. And they have united what will become the Habsburg Empire of the East, Austria, Bohemia, and Hungary. They're in a fragile union, and it is really being pushed by Charles. The idea of what's called a pragmatic sanction. He's the last of all the Habsburg males, and he pushes until his death the idea that Habsburg possessions would always be passed intact to a single heir. This is foreshadowing of what is not to come, obviously. Finally, it must be taken of note that while Austria itself and Bohemia were under full Habsburg power, the Hungarians never completely saw themselves as being fully developed and fully controlled by Habsburg absolutism. There were many uprisings of the nobility that were never completely crushed. Many remained Protestant, which people saw as a weakness if you were not religiously homogenous. They had some support from the Turks, and they had developed this sense of a nationalistic ideal under their control when they were being controlled by the Ottoman Empire. This leads to Prince Rákóczi's rebellion in 1703. Prince Rákóczi sees a window of opportunity to lead a patriotic rebellion against the Habsburgs. He feels that they're weakened right now because they are focusing their attention on the War of Spanish Succession. The rebellion gets defeated. However, this does establish some Hungarian independence because Charles VI restores many of the traditional privileges of the Hungarian nobility in exchange for acceptance of Habsburg rule. So even though on paper they agree to Habsburg rule, there are many things that are kept traditionally unique to Hungary in retaining their own sense of identity. However, we have now developed one of the major Eastern absolutist powers battling over Central Eastern Europe.